Hi, my name is Sarisha Ganta. I'm a staff attorney with the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, and we're excited to have Christina Griffin here with us today to speak to us about workplace policies in light of the COVID-19 crisis. And before Christina talks to us about this topic, I wanted to share a little information with you about Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Our mission is to provide free legal assistance to small community-based nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. We match these nonprofits with attorneys from the leading corporations and law firms in the Atlanta area. If you are interested in applying to be a client or to learn more about our organization, please visit our website at pbpatl.org. Also on our website, you'll find a wealth of resources, including past webcasts, articles, and other information that might be relevant to your organization. Also at that website, I want to highlight a few resources that are a little relevant to what Christina is going to be talking about today. And that is information about the CARES Act, the Families First Coronavirus Act, and unemployment. What Christina is going to be talking about is a little different from these other topics that I just mentioned. And we have had webcasts on those topics in the past. So we have links to those in the discussion notes on the side of the page. And we're going to try to talk about other issues aside from those today. And the last piece of disclaimer is just keep in mind that today's information that Christina will be sharing is just general advice. If you have specific questions about your organization, please reach out to your PBPA attorney. And today's presentation is copyrighted. And I thank you, Christina, so much for joining us today for this topic. I'll hand the mic over to you. And if our audience has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat function and we'll share them with Christina.
Sounds Christina? Good. So I wish we could have had the presentation in person, but obviously changing circumstances required webinar, as obviously all business is at this time. If you had asked me whether we would experience the shutdown the way we're experiencing now, I never would have believed it. Obviously, this is unexpected circumstances, and it's requiring a lot of quick and creative thinking on your part on how to keep your employees safe, how to maintain your operations, and how to comply with all of the laws. Like Sarisha said, I'm not going to go in detail today on the new laws because there are also concerns that you really need to keep in mind with other laws that were in place, long before we were dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, and that really, in some cases, make things more challenging now, but also can help provide guiding principles for your continued operations during this time. So here's just some overall principles that should really be your focus and that will guide the rest of our conversation today. And please do jump in with questions as I go along. I will try to monitor those questions as you enter them into the chat box. And Sarisha will also jump in if you have any pressing concerns or topics that we need to talk a little bit more about. I'm happy to try to do that as we go along. And then the beginning of the presentation will be more general and the end will really be some specific questions that we are seeing a lot. So I'll mention that as we go along. If there's maybe a better place to address the question, then we can do that later in the presentation. But I will try to address it at the time that it makes the most sense. Obviously, keeping everyone safe is a top priority. That is the reason for the circumstances that we're facing today. I would assume that most of you have either furloughed your employees or have them working from home at this point. If that's not the case and you still do have some employees going into the office or otherwise interacting with the public or coworkers, there's a few things that need to be priorities to make sure that you're doing what you need to keep those employees safe. The first is to make sure that their continued activities are complying with the stay-at-home orders that are in place for either the state, the city, and the county where you're operating and where the employee lives, and that you're taking some creative measures to make sure that you're making the circumstances as safe as possible. For employees that are working from home and those that may have been furloughed, obviously keeping communications open is an important focus. Even when you may not have any particular updates for the employees, just keeping them notified that you will touch base with them as soon as there is an update. Keeping regular communication open is important. And then the other two really follow that, and we'll talk about how to change your focus and keep things running to the extent that you can during this time, and positioning your organization to really come out of this when things get back to normal and be strong and be able to continue your mission. This slide covers the two new laws. Like I said, I'm not going to go into detail on these. If you are not familiar with how these will impact you currently, there's really good resources on Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's website. And for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act in particular, the fact sheet that's available on the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division website is also a really good summary and can keep you focused when you're attending different webinars or reading different articles. That fact sheet is a really concise summary of the requirements. So to start, what should you already have had in place that can help you navigate during this time? And how will those things change given the unexpected circumstances surrounding COVID-19? First of all, handbooks. I hope that everyone has a handbook for their organization because they are really good for framing the organization's purpose for employees, and there's a lot of risks that can be presented without having a handbook. For example, your employees will not necessarily know what to expect in given circumstances. Your managers may be doing things differently, and it's hard for the organization without a handbook as a guiding principle to continue to operate in the same way year after year. Therefore, a lot of risks stem from inconsistencies because more often than not, cases of discrimination or other kinds of complaints that come up in the legal world, and when you end up needing to get lawyers involved, really stem from inconsistencies that could have been avoided and would have prevented someone from looking for a potential reason that differential treatment came about. If I'm an employee and I feel like my manager's disciplined me differently than he or she has disciplined my coworkers, I may start to wonder why that was the case. And I may start to wonder, was that because of my age? Was that because I'm female? And ensuring that everyone has consistent guiding principles to govern their behavior can go a really long way in reducing that risk. Moving on to workplace posters. There are pre-existing state and federal posters that should be posted in a prevalent place on your work site, a place where all employees have access and can see those posters. And there's also a new one for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Even if you believe that because you have less than 50 employees, you qualify for an exemption under the new law. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, the new law provides an expansion of emergency paid sick leave and an expansion of the Family and Medical Leave Act. And those new laws provide new types of leave for employees who are continuing to work during this time. There is a possible exemption for small employers of less than 50, but certain requirements must be met to fall into that exemption. And even if you do believe that you fall into that exemption, this posting is still required. So for everyone, this new poster needs to be distributed to your employees. Now, ordinarily, for employees that come into the work site, you would simply post it in a visible location, such as a break room or a common area, a meeting area. Because your employees are not coming into the office right now, this should be distributed to them specifically. It can either be distributed by mail or email, but either way, it needs to go out to all of your employees. Here I've listed some other policies, and this is where we're going to focus most of the rest of the presentation, is on these other issues that you need to have on your radar to make sure you're complying with laws that are generally applicable and can add some challenges to your operations right now. Timekeeping is an important one here. So you should already have in place a policy that requires all of your non-exempt employees to track their time. And that's important because employees that work over 40 hours in a week must be paid overtime unless they're exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, as a default, all employees are required to track their time and be paid overtime. There are certain exemptions under the Fair Labor Standards Act, as you're probably familiar with. Certain employees do not have to track their time or be paid overtime if they meet certain requirements under the law. And those are traditionally thought of as your salaried employees, but just because someone receives a salary does not necessarily mean they're exempt under the law. So that's something to consider with an attorney down the road if you haven't already done so. But for your employees that are normally in the office and tracking their time, that requirement does not change even though they're now at home. So it's really important, and this is a modification that you should go ahead and implement as soon as possible if you haven't already done so. Send out a new policy that applies to employees working from home who need to track their time, and require that all employees agree that they will accurately report all of the time that they're working, that they will not work when they're not tracking their time, which would be considered off-the-clock work and can cause a lot of issues for the employer, and that they will report and request permission to work any overtime. That can be really important to help manage employees as well, just to make sure that their managers are being kept in the loop of when they're working and how much work they're doing during this time. Now, certainly, it's fine to make adjustments to their work hours to try to be flexible with the employees, but absolutely, it's critical that all hours that they are working are tracked and that they're paid for all of those hours. Safety procedures are obviously changing when employees are not in the workplace. Your prohibition on weapons in the workplace, for example, may have been a policy that you had in place. Now your safety procedures may look very different. It may include, only allowing one employee into the office at any given time to pick up supplies. Social media policies remain important because that can have to do with your privacy of other employees, privacy of your clients. It's important, that employees are not, for example, posting pictures of clients on social media. You should have a policy in place that prevents that or only allows them to do it with express permission of the leaders of the organization, and otherwise protects the privacy of the people that you're working with and interacting with in your organization. Accommodation policies are very important right now. This is one that's particularly critical given some of the issues that are arising. Certain disabilities make individuals more at risk for coronavirus, and while employers aren't entitled to assume that someone may feel more at risk or may need an accommodation, employers are certainly required to address requests for accommodation from employees. So that's something that you should be on the lookout for, and already you should have in place religious and disability accommodations policies, and those may be applicable now in the next week, in the upcoming months, more than ever. And then leave and FMLA provisions are, of course, implicated because those are the policies that are most altered by the current changes in law. So the most important kinds of practical changes that you can make right now are...
Christina, I have a quick question for you, going back to the policies.
Yes.
You had mentioned the timekeeping policy and some others, and I was just wondering how many of those can the organization do themselves, like the safety procedures recommending 6 feet of distance versus a timekeeping policy? Should they begin reaching out to their attorney to help them with updating or accommodating their timekeeping policy?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
For a timekeeping policy, is that something they should do themselves internally, or should a nonprofit reach out to their attorney to help them with revising their timekeeping policies in light of the current scenario?
You can do that either way, of course. So you'd be wise to, of course, have an attorney take a look and make sure that what you've prepared complies with the law and has all of the elements that are required under the law. But certainly I'd encourage you to go ahead and draft something and have an attorney review it from there. Attorneys don't necessarily have to be involved at the preliminary stages of drafting, and it's probably easier for them to take a look at what you've prepared and just make any necessary modifications.
Okay, and a question about accommodation policies. Do small organizations also do they have an obligation to accommodate disabilities or religious requests?
So yes, all employers should assume that they need to comply unless an attorney maybe tells you otherwise or that you've met your obligations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, everyone, I skipped ahead there. And one other point besides practical changes, which likely you all have already implemented, I wanted to address whether you need to make changes to your existing policies. So for example, you may have a handbook in place. There's no reason to go in and change your handbook or rewrite it at this time. What you should really be focusing on is implementing separate guidance. It might be a page long here or there, to get those policies out to your employees now, and those guidelines will be temporary guidelines given the circumstances. And really, these questions on the presentation are the most important ones. So if you haven't addressed these and you haven't been communicating with your employees about these issues, these are the kinds of communications, whether it's in a document or an email, that you really need to get out there. I think we've addressed most of these. Obviously, it's important that someone keeps up with the changes that are being issued and guidance being issued by the CDC, by different government organizations and agencies. The current coronavirus circumstances have changed things a little bit and provided employers more leeway to ask employees questions. For example, questions about whether they've been exposed to COVID-19 and whether they have been experiencing symptoms. Normally, some of those kinds of inquiries would either be prohibited or not recommended, and this special circumstances have allowed for expanding your inquiries. And so while you may be able to do those things right now, you don't necessarily want to assume that under any circumstances, those questions can be answered. Once this is all over, those kinds of inquiries would want to be avoided. And going back to the accommodations question, I could have maybe provided some more clarification on that. If you have less than 15 employees, Title VII and the Americans with Disabilities Act will not cover you as an employer, and therefore you would not have an obligation to implement the accommodation, but you would have the option to choose to do so, and you would want to have an attorney help you assess whether you have triggered that 15 employee requirement before assuming that you're not covered. I'm going to skip this slide for now. We will talk about it as we go along, as we talk about these practical issues. So the first practical issue is implementing safety procedures. If you have all of your employees working from home, that is great. You probably don't need to be concerned about the OSHA guidance, which covers in-workplace precautions. But there's different kinds of protective mechanisms that OSHA recommends and requires for the protection of employees, because employers have an obligation to keep their employees safe. So these different kinds of protective mechanisms here are listed in order from most protective to least protective, and these can give you examples of the kinds of things to be concerned about, and kinds of ideas of what you can implement to really make sure that your employees are safe. For example, engineering controls, administrative controls, those would be the best kinds of practices that you can put in place if your employees are still either coming into the workplace or otherwise dealing with the public. And then safe work procedures and personal protective equipment would be the next two to consider, and you'll likely be doing a combination of all of these things. Does anyone have any questions so far?
No, not at the
Okay,
moment.
I'll jump into the next practical issue that you might be dealing with then, which is addressing your employees' safety concerns. And here we're going to go back to the accommodation issue. So likely your employees have different kinds of concerns. You know, some employees may be generally healthy, and their concerns are primarily for themselves to make sure that they're not getting sick, but also for family members and for those that they may know or be friends with, who have greater risk factors than they do. So there's, of course, this baseline fear and concern about health for all employees. But certain employees may be at greater risk for some reason, and they may have escalated concerns. So employees, for example, who are recovering from cancer treatment, or employees who have ongoing heart issues. Those employees may have other concerns that don't necessarily affect the general public or the rest of your workforce. Similarly, older employees may have concerns because the CDC has issued recommendations that provide special warnings to people over a certain age. So those concerns need to be addressed, but carefully. So an employer should, of course, consider providing additional accommodations to an employee who requests them if they have an ongoing medical issue that would qualify as a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And of course, again, if you're covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I would advise that you assume that you are, unless you have some clarification that you are not covered because you're simply too small. But to the extent that you are a covered employer and an employee requests an accommodation, you can address that in two ways. First, determine whether they have a condition that qualifies as a disability, which again, the safest assumption is to assume that a condition is considered a disability under the law, and proceed to the second step, which is to engage in the interactive process with that employee to determine whether their accommodation can be granted or whether a different accommodation can be granted that allows them to perform the essential functions of their job. That's again something that an attorney can help you with if you run into an issue where it looks like you may not be able to accommodate an employee who's requested an accommodation. That's the point where I would recommend getting an attorney involved. If you're able to speak with the attorney and work with them and reach an agreement about the accommodation that will be provided, then that's the best course of action. You don't necessarily need legal help to address their concerns in that way. But really, if you anticipate not being able to provide an accommodation, I'd recommend getting an attorney involved and making sure you've taken all of the necessary steps to comply with the law and comply with your obligations on providing accommodations. On the other side of the coin here, though, is to be careful of discrimination issues, particularly discrimination against an employee who may have a disability or who you consider to have a disability if you are making assumptions without proper basis and without true knowledge. You could run into an issue if, say, a lot of your workforce is still working, but you tell one employee that they're not going to be permitted onto the work site because you have concerns about their health. If the employee doesn't share those concerns, then you certainly have a potential disability discrimination issue. The same would go for treating any older workers differently than you treat the rest of your workforce. Consistency is important, and it should really be the employer that responds to any employee concerns about their safety and security, rather than the employer making assumptions about any particular employee's situation. And if you proceed in that way, you're less likely to encounter any major legal issues as you navigate this process. It's important as you're because of that approach, because of that recommended approach, your best first step is to ensure safety across the board, ensure that all of your employees are being put into a position that is safe for them and that everyone's being treated the same, or at least that all similarly situated people, for example, people in the same kind of role, are being treated the same. And when you do that, one of the guidelines that will enable you to do that in the best way is to either implement work from home procedures or to ensure that sick employees are not in the workplace. And to do that, part of it is a culture issue. You need to make sure that employees feel comfortable taking time off, whether that's paid or unpaid. They need to have options to make sure that they're able to comply with the CDC guidelines and that they're not creating greater risk for your other employees if they may come into contact with them. So that could be a culture issue. Certainly provide leave if you're able to do so. And of course, if the new laws apply to you and that you're required to do so. Require, if you have employees that are coming into the workplace and either potentially exposing other employees or potentially exposing the public, implement a mandatory reporting of symptoms and implement mandatory reporting of any person that they may have come into contact with who has COVID-19. It's important here to keep these kinds of inquiries general. You do not want to ask specifically whether an employee's family member has COVID-19. Rather, you'd want to be a lot more general and ask whether the employee believes that they have come into contact with someone who may have COVID-19. And if they do, and if they have their own symptoms that could potentially indicate COVID-19, then they should not be permitted into the workplace or permitted to interact with the public, other than in extremely, extremely limited circumstances, such as the amount of time that it would take to remove them from the workplace and get them to, a safe location or back to their home. Certainty is unlikely. The CDC and other government agencies don't recommend requiring doctor's notes at this time. While certainly there are circumstances where employers are permitted to have and request medical documentation, it's a better course of action given the uncertainty and the demands on the medical field right now to proceed as if the employee may have COVID-19 or as if the employee may have a disability, and be a little bit more flexible than you may otherwise be on the kinds of documentation that the employee has to provide to be entitled to leave and benefits and accommodations.
Christina, I have a question about the last slide. For organizations where the workforce they're essential service providers or they otherwise need to be coming into the work site, can they require that individuals wear, for example, face masks or reprimand employees if they're not maintaining proper protocol that they might have tried to set in place, like staying 6 feet apart? What are your thoughts on that?
It's certainly fine and recommended to require that employees are 6 feet apart and recommend that face masks be worn. I wouldn't recommend mandating that face masks are worn given the unavailability of those in some circumstances. Employees should be allowed to wear them if they have them and they would like to. And certainly if they're interacting with the public, employees who have face masks could be moved into more public-facing roles, and employees without face masks for safety concerns could potentially be moved into less public-facing roles to the extent that that's feasible for you to do. But there could also be potential concerns mandating that face masks be worn, because some employees simply might not be able to do that. They might have respiratory issues, for example, that might really hinder them from wearing masks. So while I would recommend that it is encouraged and that maintaining 6 feet of distance is required, the face mask issue could be a little bit more complicated.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly, just like any other time, though, if an employer puts into place a policy like maintaining 6-foot distance and not using colleagues' work phones or work supplies, an employee is not complying with a direct direction of the manager, discipline could be issued. You just want to make sure that you're not violating some other kind of law, such as a disability or other kind of discrimination. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation, a lot of issues can be avoided by keeping communications open and ensuring consistency and clarity. The same is true with keeping employees informed during this time period. So it's advisable to continue your external communications with employees who may have been furloughed if you would like to bring them back potentially when this emergency is over. And with your donors, with your clients, with the public, that need to be informed about the responses that you're taking during this time and how you're ensuring everyone's safety during this time. My general experience is that people want to help. People that are healthy want to help people who may have more difficulty or may need to take extra precautions during this time. And so let your donors and your community members know how they can help your organization, because everyone is experiencing something different during this time. People are apart, dealing with different issues that they may not ordinarily be dealing with. But also some people have more time because of it. Goals are changing, priorities are changing, missions are changing. So certainly stay up to date and issue publications and communications as often as you can about changes as they take place. One thing to keep in mind is that community employees cannot serve as volunteers for your organization without that time being tracked and considered on the clock. So this goes back to the distinction between exempt and non-exempt employees that I mentioned earlier. Exempt employees generally receive pay for their salary for all hours worked. And if you have an employee who's exempt and paid on a salary, then potentially they can help with any kind of duty, even if it's outside of their normal job description and normal duties for you. Now, if an employee is non-exempt, on the other hand, they can certainly be asked to do different kinds of duties during this time. There's no requirement that employees only do work that's within their job description. But that said, anytime that they are doing work for the organization of any kind, then that would be paid time. And if they reach 40 hours in any given work week, then they would need to be paid overtime for the hours over 40 hours. Another issue that you all may be dealing with is maintaining the operations that you've decided are critical and that can't be stopped during this time or can't be adjusted during this time with changing circumstances. So with employees who are absent, employees who unexpectedly can't log on because of childcare issues and things like that. So to help a little bit with the ongoing operations, these are things to consider. Certainly consider reorganizing and utilizing employees that may not be able to do their typical role and perform their typical duties right now. Give cross-training to those employees, have them engage in training that they may not ordinarily have time for to expand their role. Potentially consider whether you're an organization that needs new hires during this time, or can you rely on volunteers and other community members to help fill gaps or fill in when employees might be absent or sick or otherwise unavailable. And talk to your employees too about adjustments that need to be made during this time. Again, flexibility and accommodations are important, even if not legally mandated right now. It can go a long way in just improving your employee relations and maintaining the strength of your organization to be accommodating to your employees to the extent that you can. So talk to them about whether they can perform their job remotely and get all of their job duties done, maybe in different hours or adjusted hours than they might ordinarily work. If that's not feasible for you, there's certainly no requirement to do that, but it can help benefit the employee and the organization both during this time. Managing employees is another thing to keep in mind. Being apart does not change your authority to, for example, discipline employees for not performing their work, for not being available when you expect them to be available and online, for example. It's advisable to have regular one-on-one check-ins with managers and with individual employees that can help alert you to any issues. And really, it should be the organization's goal to ask employees about what obstacles are hindering them from performing their jobs during this time and addressing those obstacles to the extent that you can. And documentation is always an issue for employers, especially in this remote environment. You might be emailing, or you might be having a phone call with employees. And if an employee is not meeting your expectations during this time, that should be discussed with them, and it should also be documented in either an email or another document that summarizes your conversation and reflects that certain improvements need to be made or certain changes need to be made so that they can satisfactorily perform their duties. Also ask for feedback from your employees. Obviously, this is a changing time, and it's important to address employee concerns that can go a long way in making sure that you're not potentially missing something that employees need to have addressed, or that is inconsistent, or a concern that demonstrates some kind of challenge between your previous procedures and what's arisen in the COVID-19 crisis. The other thing that I would recommend that each of you focus on as you're thinking about safety concerns, as you're thinking about managing your employees in light of COVID-19 and work from home increasing, as you're thinking about avoiding discrimination issues and accommodating employees where necessary, I'd also encourage you to review your policies and, like I said before, implement new guidelines, implement new communications that are temporary in nature, but that address the changing concerns and changing circumstances. You can also always go back and look into some of the decisions that you've made over the past few weeks as you settle into this new circumstance for this week. Of course, it might be different next week, but as the situation progresses, you may change your needs. You may recognize that a decision that was made on an urgent basis needs to be reassessed. And that's certainly possible to do, get an attorney involved to the extent that you need to. But a lot of legal issues are best addressed promptly. And so you have a lot of options for resolving issues that may have arisen. The sooner the better. And obviously, your ongoing organizational priorities will also be changing. So when you have an opportunity and you don't have any immediate disciplinary issues or employee issues to address, you can address your mission, you can address your ongoing strategy priorities, and address the way that your workforce will work and look going forward. And part of that can be addressing whether you have properly classified your employees as exempt and non-exempt, and that you understand what requirements there are if you consider an employee exempt and that employee isn't tracking their time. You need to make sure that you are understanding the law on those subjects, and that your workforce is in good shape as you go forward and move out of this emergency circumstance. If no one has any other questions, I'll just briefly mention that a lot of the guidance today is really to be as flexible as you can. Certainly, there's no requirement that the organization itself suffer and fail to meet its goals. But to the extent that you can, be understanding of interruptions on your employees' time, stress and anxiety that they might be dealing with right now, distractions. You can hopefully address those to best serve the organization's needs rather than feeling that the employees' needs are maybe working against the organization's. Ideally, you're able to communicate with your employees enough that everyone is able to meet their goals, and that you're able to address employee concerns in the way that makes them feel satisfied and accommodated, even where there's no legal requirement to do so, simply because that will position you in the best way to move forward and come out of this crisis.
Well, thank you so much, Christina, for sharing your insight and advice today. And thank you so much to our audience members for joining us today, and for all of the great work that you guys continue to strive to do in the current environment. Please feel free, if you don't have any more questions for Christina today, reach out to your PBPA attorneys. We're here to help you and do what we can to advise you during this time. And with that, thank you guys for joining us today.